The rain came down in sheets, slashing against the windshield of Victor Grayson's Bentley as it glided over the Brooklyn Bridge. It was late. Too late for Manhattan streets to hum with anything but the hiss of tires on wet asphalt. At 58, Victor, CEO of Grayson Enterprises, should have been home in his Upper East Side mansion, surrounded by the hollow elegance of marble floors and crystal chandeliers. Instead, he was here, gripping the wheel with one hand, the other cradling a cold coffee cup from the office, his nightly ritual to stave off the silence that waited for him. The city lights blurred through the rain, a kaleidoscope of gold and white against the black night. Victor's eyes, sharp and unyielding, traced the lines of the bridge ahead, but his mind was elsewhere. 25 years ago, he'd walked away from Margaret. Not out of ambition alone, though that's what he told himself in the early days when he built his empire from the ashes of his father's failures. No, it was fear. Fear of not being enough, of dragging her into the same poverty that had broken his family when his father's business collapsed. He'd chosen the boardroom over her gentle eyes, the promise of wealth over the warmth of her touch. And now, all he had was this, a car worth more than most people's homes, a title that echoed in headlines, and a solitude that gnawed at him, like a relentless tide. The silver chain around his neck shifted as he adjusted his grip, the wedding ring dangling against his chest, a secret he'd kept from everyone. It wasn't a keepsake of love, not anymore. It was a weight, a quiet punishment for the man he'd become. He'd slipped it off his finger the day he left her, but he could never bring himself to let it go entirely. It hung there, cold against his skin, a reminder of the honor he'd traded for success. A sudden glare cut through the rain. Headlights, too close, too fast. A truck swerved across the lane, its horn blaring a jagged warning. Victor's breath caught, but his hands stayed steady. Years of discipline kicked in, the kind that had carried him through hostile takeovers and sleepless nights. He jerked, the wheel, the Bentley skidding toward the guardrail. Metal screamed as the car struck, the impact jarring his bones. The coffee cup flew from his hand, splashing dark stains across the leather interior. Then, silence, save for the rain hammering, the roof and the faint hum of the dying engine. He didn't panic. Not Victor Grayson. His pulse raced, but his face remained a mask of calm, honed by decades of controlling boardrooms and burying regrets. He pressed a hand to his chest, feeling the ring bite into his skin through his shirt. Alive. That was enough for now. The truck's lights faded into the distance, leaving him stranded in the storm. Minutes, or maybe hours, passed before the wail of sirens pierced the night. Red and blue flashed against the wet steel of the bridge. A paramedic's voice broke through the haze, sharp and urgent. "Sir, can you hear me? Stay with me." Victor nodded, his throat tight, but his mind drifted again. Margaret. Her name slipped into his thoughts unbidden, a whisper from a life he'd locked away. He saw her as she'd been then, young, fierce, her hands soft but her spirit unbreakable. He'd left her to prove he wasn't his father, to build something that couldn't crumble. And yet, here he was, broken on a bridge, with nothing but a cold ring to show for it. The stretcher came next, cold metal beneath him as they carried him from the wreckage. The rain stung his face, but he didn't flinch. Control. He clung to it like a lifeline, even as his vision blurred at the edges. The ambulance doors slammed shut, and the world narrowed to the beep of machines and the murmur of voices. One voice stood out, low, steady, familiar. "Victor? Victor, stay awake. You're going to be fine." His eyes snapped open, searching the dim interior. A woman leaned over him, her face half-shadowed by the flickering lights. Her hands moved with quiet precision, adjusting an IV line, her scrub sleeves brushing his arm. He couldn't see her clearly, not yet, but that voice cut through the fog like a blade. Margaret. It couldn't be. His chest tightened, the ring pressing harder against his sternum as if it knew her too. He tried to speak, but his voice was a rasp, lost in the chaos. "Hold on," she said, her tone firm but warm, the kind of strength that didn't need to shout. She hadn't recognized him, not in this mess of blood and rain and shattered glass. Or maybe she had, and chose silence. Either way, the sound of her pulled him back, anchoring him to the moment. His fingers twitched toward the chain, but he stopped himself. Not now. Not like this. The ambulance jolted over a bump and pain flared through his ribs. He gritted his teeth, swallowing it down. He wouldn't break. Not in front of her. Not in front of anyone. But the questions burned. How was she here? Why was she here? A nurse. In a rundown ambulance when he'd left her to escape a life of struggle? The irony twisted in his gut. Sharp and bitter. As the vehicle sped toward the hospital, Victor's gaze locked on the ceiling, rain still drumming in his ears. He didn't know if this was chance or fate, but one thing was clear. The past he'd buried wasn't done with him. The ring hung heavy, a silent witness to the honor he'd lost and maybe, just maybe, a chance to reclaim it. He closed his eyes, not in surrender but in resolve. Whatever came next, he'd face it. Not with anger or desperation, but with the quiet dignity he'd forgotten he could possess. The ambulance slowed, and her voice faded into the clamor of the emergency bay. Victor exhaled, steadying himself for what lay ahead. The night wasn't over. Neither was he. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and exhaustion, a sharp tang that cut through the fog in Victor Grayson's mind. He lay on a stiff gurney in the emergency ward, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like a swarm of restless insects. Pain throbbed in his ribs with every breath, but he kept his face still, a mask of composure forged over decades in boardrooms where weakness was a death sentence. The chaos of the night clung to him, the rain, the crash, the voice, but he held it at bay, his fingers brushing the chain around his neck where the ring rested, cold and unyielding. A curtain rustled, and she was there. Margaret. The woman he'd left 25 years ago stood before him, older now, her face etched with lines he didn't recognize, but her eyes, those fierce, gentle eyes, were unmistakable. She wore faded scrubs, the sleeves frayed at the edges, and her hands moved with quiet purpose as she checked his chart. Her hair, once a cascade of chestnut waves, was pulled back in a tight bun, streaked with gray. She didn't look at him, not yet. She hadn't connected the battered man on the gurney with the billionaire, whose name graced skyscrapers and headlines. Victor's throat tightened, but he swallowed it down. Margaret, he said, his voice low, rough from the crash and something deeper. Her hands froze, the clipboard trembling for a split second before she steadied it. She looked up, and their gazes locked. Recognition flickered in her eyes, followed by a wall of calm that shut him out. "Mr. Grayson," she replied, her tone clipped, professional. "You're stable. Bruised ribs, minor cuts. You'll live." She turned back to the chart, as if he were just another patient, but the slight quiver in her jaw betrayed her. She knew, and she wasn't going to make this easy. He shifted, wincing as pain flared, but kept his voice even. "I'm sorry." The words slipped out, unpolished, raw, words he'd rehearsed in his mind for years but never dared speak. They hung in the air, fragile and inadequate. Margaret didn't flinch. She set the clipboard down with deliberate care, her fingers brushing the edge like she was steadying herself. "You chose your path, Victor," she said, her voice steady, but edged with steel. "You chose it over me. Don't expect an apology to erase 25 years of living with that." She didn't raise her voice, didn't lash out. Her restraint cut deeper than anger ever could. He wanted to argue, to explain. How he'd left to spare her the poverty he'd known as a child. How he'd feared failing her the way his father had failed his mother. But the excuses felt hollow now, staring into the face of a woman who'd clearly fought battles he couldn't imagine. Instead, he nodded, a small, measured gesture. "I don't expect anything," he said quietly. "I just needed you to hear it." She didn't respond, her lips pressing into a thin line as she adjusted his IV line. Her hands were rough, calloused, hands that had worked, not rested. Victor's mind flashed to their last night together, her fingers soft against his cheek as she begged him to stay. He'd walked away, convinced he was protecting her. Now, seeing her in this dim, crumbling hospital, he wondered what he'd really protected, her, or his own pride. A memory surfaced, unbidden. Their tiny apartment in Queens, the chipped mug she'd filled with coffee every morning, the way she'd hum while washing dishes. He'd loved her then, loved her enough to leave, Or so he'd told himself. The ring pressed against his chest, a silent rebuke. He'd built an empire since then. Offices of glass and steel, a mansion that echoed with emptiness. But she'd built something else. Survival. Strength. A life he'd had no part in. Footsteps approached, and a young nurse poked her head through the curtain. "Margaret, we need you in Bay 3. Margaret nodded, but before she turned away, Victor caught her wrist. Gently, not a demand. She stiffened, her eyes narrowing, but she didn't pull free. "How did you end up here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Not an accusation, just a question. He needed to know what had become of the woman he'd left behind. She met his gaze, unflinching. "I didn't end up anywhere, Victor. I made a life. One step at a time, without you." Her words were a quiet blade, slicing through the years between them. She slipped her wrist from his grasp and stepped back. "Rest. You'll be discharged. Soon." As she disappeared behind the curtain, Victor exhaled, the pain in his ribs sharpening with the breath. He didn't chase her, not with words, not with force. That wasn't his way. He'd spent a lifetime mastering control, and he wouldn't lose it now, not even as his world tilted on its axis. But her presence lingered, a ghost in the sterile air, and with it came a question he couldn't shake. What had she endured while he climbed? The curtain swayed and a shadow moved beyond it. A man with a camera, his lens glinting under the neon glow of the exit sign. Victor's jaw tightened. A reporter. He'd seen enough of them to know the type, hungry for a story, careless with the wreckage they left behind. The man snapped a photo, the flash blinding, catching Victor's hand still outstretched where Margaret had been. She'd steadied him just for a moment, and now that moment was caught. Fodder for tomorrow's headlines. Victor lowered his hand, folding it across his chest where the ring lay hidden. He wouldn't react, wouldn't give the vulture the satisfaction. But the weight of it settled in. The world would see this, twist it, and Margaret would be dragged into the mess he'd made. He closed his eyes, the buzz of the lights fading, into the background. He'd left her once to shield her from his failures. Now, fate had brought her back, and with her, a chance to face what he'd run from. The pain ebbed, but the questions didn't. Margaret was here, a nurse in a place he'd never imagined her, and he was still the man who'd walked away. The ring pressed against his skin, a quiet vow forming in the stillness. Whatever came next, he'd meet it with the dignity he owed her, even if she never knew it. Victor Grayson stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his office, 30 stories, above Manhattan's restless pulse. The city sprawled beneath him, a glittering beast tamed by his will, or so he'd once believed. Rain streaked the glass, blurring the skyline into a watercolor haze, but it couldn't soften the clamor rising from the street below. Reporters swarmed the entrance of Grayson Enterprises headquarters, their cameras flashing like gunfire, their voices a dull roar even through the soundproof panes. The photo from the hospital had hit the tabloids by morning. Billionaire CEO clings to mystery nurse after crash. The headline was a cheap shot, but it had teeth. Inside, the boardroom hummed with tension. Victor turned from the window, his polished shoes silent on the hardwood floor, and faced the half-dozen suits seated around the mahogany table. Their eyes darted between him and the tablets displaying the latest news alerts. His assistant, Claire, hovered near the door, her fingers twisting the edge of her notepad. The air smelled of espresso and unease. Another late night, another crisis. Victor's ribs ached beneath his tailored suit, a dull reminder of the crash, but he stood straight, hands clasped behind his back. Control was his armor, and he wouldn't let it crack. "Victor," said Harold Vance, the gray-haired chairman, his voice clipped with irritation. "This is a distraction we don't need. The merger's on the line, and now we've got the, press sniffing around some nurse?" He waved a hand at the tablet, where the grainy photo stared back. Victor reaching for Margaret, her face turned just enough to obscure her identity. "Who is she? And why does it look like you're begging?" The room shifted, a collective intake of breath. Victor felt the sting. Harold's words were a calculated jab at his pride. But he didn't flinch. His jaw tightened, the ring beneath his shirt pressing into his chest like a silent anchor. "She's someone I knew," he said, his tone measured, cool. "A long time ago, that's all you need to know." He wouldn't give them Margaret's name, wouldn't let them drag her into their sterile calculations. She'd already borne enough of his mistakes. Harold leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "That's not enough. The board needs answers. Investors are jittery, and this—" He tapped the screen. "Looks personal. Weak. Fix it, or we will." Victor met his gaze unflinching. "It's handled," he said, a quiet steel threading his words. He wouldn't grovel, wouldn't explain the 25 years of silence between him and the woman who'd saved him last night. The board could stew in their suspicions. He'd built this company with his own hands, and he'd weather this storm the same way. Alone, if he had to. But he wasn't alone, not entirely. Across the city, in a cramped apartment above a bodega, Margaret stood. At her kitchen counter, a knife paused mid-slice through a carrot. The radio crackled beside her, a tinny voice spinning the story. Victor Grayson, titan of industry, caught in a tender moment with an unknown nurse. She didn't need to see the photo to know it was her. The reporters had found her by noon, banging on her door, shouting questions through the mail slot. She'd locked it tight, drawn the blinds, and gone back to her routine. Cooking dinner, the same way she had for years, alone. Her hands moved again, steady, slicing the carrot into thin rounds. She wouldn't run, wouldn't hide. She'd faced, worse than cameras, nights with no heat, bills she couldn't pay, the ache of a life rebuilt from scraps. Victor's world might be crumbling under the spotlight, but hers wouldn't. Not again. The radio droned on, speculating about their past, and she reached over, flicking it off with a flick of her wrist. Silence settled, broken only by the rhythmic chop of the knife. Back at the tower, Victor dismissed the board with a nod, waiting until the room emptied before sinking into his chair. The ache in his ribs flared, but it was nothing compared to the weight of what he'd seen in Margaret's eyes last night. Resilience, yes, but also a quiet wound he'd left behind. He pulled a drawer open, fishing out a small wooden box he kept hidden beneath contracts and pens. Inside was a letter, yellowed and creased, one he'd found years ago when cleaning out his old desk. Her handwriting stared back at him. "Victor, don't go. I'll wait." She'd never sent it. He hadn't known she'd written it until long, after he'd walked away, convinced he was sparing her a life of struggle. He traced the words with a fingertip, the ring shifting against his chest. She'd waited. Maybe not for him, but for something. And he'd given her nothing but absence. Now the world was watching, turning her sacrifice into a circus. He snapped the box shut, the sound sharp in the empty room. He wouldn't let them touch her, not with their headlines, not with their lies. But how could he shield her when he'd already failed her once? His phone buzzed. Claire, her voice tight. "Sir, the press is downstairs. They're asking for a statement." Victor stood smoothing his tie, the motion automatic. "No comment," he said, firm but calm. He wouldn't feed the beast, wouldn't let them bait him into a reaction. That wasn't who he was, not anymore. Across town, Margaret plated her dinner, a simple stew, the kind she'd perfected over years of stretching pennies. The knocks had stopped, the reporters retreating for now, but she knew they'd be back. She sat at her small table, the chair creaking under her weight, and took a slow bite. The stew was warm, grounding, a quiet defiance against the storm outside her door. She didn't need Victor's protection, didn't need his world. She'd built her own, brick by brick, and no headline could take that away. Victor stepped to the window again, watching the crowd thin as dusk settled over the city, the ring pressed against his skin, a vow forming in the stillness. He'd face this, not with anger, not with power, but with the dignity he owed her. The whispers of the crowd could howl all they wanted. He'd stand firm, for her, for the man he might still become. The neon sign outside the diner buzzed faintly, casting a sickly glow through the rain-streaked window. Victor Grayson sat in a corner booth, his tailored coat draped over the cracked vinyl seat beside him. The place was a relic, grease-stained menus, flickering bulbs, the kind of spot he hadn't stepped into since his early days clawing up from nothing. But tonight, it was where he needed to be. Across the street, the hospital loomed, its gray bulk a silent witness to the life Margaret had built without him. He'd come here after the boardroom, after the reporters, after the weight of her letter settled into his bones. He needed answers, not demands, just truth. The coffee in front of him steamed, untouched, its bitter scent mingling with the fry grease in the air. His ribs ached, a dull pulse beneath his shirt, but he ignored it, his hands resting steady on the table. The ring hung against his chest, a quiet reminder of the man he'd failed to be. He'd left the office without a word to Claire, driven through the city's chaos to this forgotten edge of Manhattan, drawn by a pull he couldn't name. Margaret's shift would end soon. He'd checked with a discreet call to the hospital, a move that felt intrusive but necessary. He wouldn't ambush her, wouldn't force her. He just wanted to see her, to ask what he'd missed in the 25 years he'd turned his back. The bell above the door jingled, and there she was. Margaret stepped in, her scrubs damp from the rain, a worn umbrella dripping at her side. She didn't see him at first, shaking water from her sleeves with a weary grace that tugged at something deep in Victor's chest. She ordered a tea at the counter, her voice low but firm, then turned and froze. Their eyes met across the dim room, and for a moment, the world shrank to just them. The billionaire in his shadowed booth, the nurse with her calloused hands and unyielding gaze. She didn't run. She walked over, deliberate, and slid into the seat across from him, setting her tea down with a soft clink. "You're persistent," she said, her tone dry but not hostile. "I figured you'd send a lawyer or a check, not show up here." Victor leaned back, keeping his posture open, non-threatening. "I didn't come to buy anything, Margaret," he said quietly. "I came to listen." His voice was steady, a practiced calm that masked the storm inside. He wouldn't push her. He'd learned that much from last night. But he needed to understand the woman she'd become, the life he'd left her to face alone. She studied him, her fingers curling around the mug, the steam rising between them, like a fragile wall. "What do you want to know?" she asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. "That I survived? That I didn't fall apart when you walked away?" "I did, Victor. One step at a time." He nodded, absorbing her words like a blow. He'd earned. "I don't doubt it," he said. "But how? What happened after I left?" He kept his tone gentle, not a demand but a plea. The ring pressed against his skin, a silent echo of the guilt he carried. Margaret took a slow sip of her tea, her gaze drifting to the window where rain traced jagged paths down the glass. "It wasn't easy," she said finally, her voice low, measured. "I worked, waitressing, cleaning, anything I could find. There were nights I didn't eat, days I almost lost the apartment, but I kept going. I had to." She didn't look at him as she spoke, her focus on some distant point beyond the diner's walls, but her words carried a strength that filled the space between them. Victor's chest tightened, but he didn't interrupt. He pictured her in that tiny Queens apartment they'd shared, the one he'd abandoned, her alone, counting coins, scrubbing floors while he signed deals in penthouse suites. He'd told himself she'd be better off without him, that his fear of failure would only drag her down. Now hearing her quiet resilience, he saw the lie he'd lived. "Why didn't you ask for help?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "From me? From anyone?" She met his eyes then, a spark of defiance flashing in hers. "Because I didn't need you to save me, Victor," she said, her words sharp but not bitter. "I saved myself. That's what you never understood. I wasn't waiting for you to come back with a fortune. I was building something of my own." Her hand tightened around the mug, but her face stayed calm, a testament to the dignity she'd forged through years he'd missed. He swallowed, the ring a cold weight against his heart. "I thought I was protecting you," he admitted, the confession slipping out despite his control. "From me. From what I might become. I was wrong." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't respond right away. The silence stretched, heavy with the years they couldn't reclaim. Then the bell jingled again, and a woman in scrubs, another nurse, rushed in, breathless. "Margaret, you won't believe this," she said, oblivious to Victor. "They're saying you've been working doubles for years to pay off some old debt. Everyone's talking about it. Something about a lawsuit tied to Grayson Enterprises." Victor's blood ran cold. Margaret's face didn't change, but her hand stilled, the mug trembling slightly before she set it down. "Thanks, Lisa," she said, her voice flat. "I'll handle it." The nurse nodded and darted back out, leaving a silence that pressed against Victor's ears. He stared at her, the pieces clicking into place. "A debt?" he asked, his voice low, careful. "What lawsuit?" Margaret looked at him, her eyes steady but guarded. "It's nothing you need to worry about," she said, rising from the booth. "You've got your world, Victor. Leave mine alone." She grabbed her umbrella and walked out, the bells, chime fading into the rain. Victor sat frozen, the untouched coffee cooling before him. A debt tied to him. 20 years of double shifts, her hands roughened by labor he hadn't seen. The ring burned against his chest, a vow he hadn't kept. He wouldn't chase her, not yet, but he'd find the truth. Not to control it, but to face it, with the dignity he owed her, and the man he still might be. Victor Grayson stood outside Margaret's apartment building, the rain a steady drum against his umbrella. The bodega below glowed faintly, its neon sign flickering in the dusk, casting jagged shadows on the cracked sidewalk. He shouldn't be here, not after she'd walked away from him at the diner, her words a quiet wall he couldn't breach. But the nurse's slip about a debt tied to Grayson Enterprises gnawed at him, a splinter he couldn't ignore. He'd spent the day digging, discreet calls to old contacts, a favor from a lawyer friend, but found nothing concrete. The truth, he knew, lay with her. And so he'd come, not to demand, but to seek. The stairs creaked under his polished shoes, each step a trespass into a life he'd abandoned. Her door was at the end of a narrow hall, paint peeling from the frame, a faint light seeping beneath. He hesitated, the ring pressing against his chest through his damp shirt. She was working the night shift. He'd checked again, a habit born of precision, not obsession. He shouldn't enter, shouldn't invade her world like this. But the need to know, to face what he'd wrought, overrode his restraint. He slipped a thin tool from his pocket, a trick from his leaner years, and the lock gave with a soft click. Inside, the apartment was small, worn, but alive with her. A sagging couch sat against one wall, a quilt draped over it, its stitches uneven but meticulous. A table held a chipped mug, half full of cold tea, and a radio tuned to static. On a shelf, a faded photo caught his eye. Him and Margaret, younger, laughing in that Queen's apartment they'd shared. His throat tightened, but he pushed it down, his hands steady as he scanned the room. He wasn't here to reminisce. He was here for answers. A wooden box sat on the counter, its lid ajar. Inside, papers spilled out. Bills, receipts, a life documented in ink and numbers. Victor's fingers brushed a leather-bound notebook, its edges frayed from use. He opened it, and the world tilted. Pages of neat handwriting chronicled payments, dates, amounts, a relentless march across 2 decades. March 2005, $500 to Kane & Associates. July 2007, $300. November 2010, $450. The totals dwindled over time, but the name, Kane & Associates, struck him like a fist. Robert Kane, the lawyer who'd sued Grayson Enterprises years ago, a bitter fight over a failed merger Victor had won. A fight he'd thought was over. His breath caught, but he kept his grip firm, flipping through the pages. 20 years of payments, her wages bled dry to settle something tied to him. He sank onto a chair, the one she must sit in every night, its cushion worn thin, and stared at the numbers. The ring burned against his skin, a silent accusation. He'd built his empire on victories like that lawsuit, celebrated with champagne while she'd paid the price in double shifts and sleepless nights. The door creaked open, and Margaret stood. There, her scrubs rumpled, her face pale under the hall's dim light. She'd come home early, maybe a canceled shift, maybe instinct. Her eyes widened, then narrowed, locking on the notebook in his hands. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was low, controlled, but it carried a weight that pinned him in place. Victor rose, setting the book on the table with deliberate care. "I had to know," he said, his tone steady despite the storm in his chest. "This debt, Kane and Associates, it's because of me, isn't it?" He didn't raise his voice, didn't plead. He stood there, hands at his sides, offering her the truth he'd pieced together. She stepped inside, closing the door with a soft thud. "You don't belong here, Victor," she said, her words sharp but not angry. "You don't get to walk in and dig through my life like it's yours to fix." She crossed to the table, her fingers brushing the notebook before pulling it close, a shield against him. "Tell me," he said, softer now, a request, not a command. "What did I do to you?" His ribs ached, his pulse thrummed, but he held himself still, the discipline of a lifetime keeping him from crumbling. Margaret's gaze met his, unflinching. "You won," she said simply. "That lawsuit years ago. Kane lost everything, his firm, his reputation. He came after me, said I owed him because you'd walked away. Legal fees, penalties, whatever, he could pin on me. I paid it, Victor, every cent, so you wouldn't have to." Her voice didn't waver, but her hands trembled as she clutched the notebook, the only crack in her armor. Victor's knees buckled, but he caught himself, gripping the chair. The twist hit hard. Kane had lost the suit, but he'd turned the knife on Margaret, a revenge Victor hadn't seen. 20 years of her labor, her silence to protect him from a debt he didn't even know existed. "Why?" he whispered, the word raw, unguarded. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't need you," she said, her eyes blazing with a quiet fire. "I didn't want your money or your pity. I handled it, my way, my strength." She straightened, the notebook pressed to her chest. "You don't have the right to come here and take that from me." He nodded, slow, deliberate, the ring a cold weight he couldn't escape. "I'm sorry," he said, and this time it wasn't rehearsed. It was real, a fracture in his control he couldn't mend. "I didn't know." "You didn't ask," she replied, turning away. "Go, Victor. Leave me my life." Her voice held no malice, just a weary resolve that cut deeper than any shout. He stepped back, the room shrinking around him. He wouldn't argue, wouldn't fight. He'd trespassed enough, but as he reached the door he paused, looking at her, the quilt, the mug, the chair she'd worn down with her endurance. "I'll make it right," he said, barely audible. "Not for me, for you." She didn't answer, didn't turn. Victor left, the rain swallowing him as he descended the stairs. The notebook's pages burned in his mind, a ledger of his sins. He'd face Kane, face the truth, not with anger, but with the dignity he owed her. The ring pressed against his heart, a vow he'd keep this time. Victor Grayson stepped into the offices of Kane and Associates, the air thick with the scent of polished wood and old money. The building was a shadow of its former glory, once a rival to his own empire, now reduced to a single floor in a midtown high-rise, its walls lined with faded diplomas and framed headlines from better days. He'd come alone, no lawyers, no entourage, just the ring against his chest and the weight of Margaret's notebook in his mind. The rain had stopped, leaving the city slick and gleaming outside, but inside, a storm brewed, one he'd face with the calm he'd honed over decades. Robert Kane sat behind a desk cluttered with papers, his hair thinning, his suit ill-fitting, man diminished but still sharp-eyed. He looked up as Victor entered, a smirk curling his lips. "Grayson," he drawled, leaning back in his chair. "Didn't expect you to slum it down here. What's this? Guilt finally catch up with you?" His voice dripped with mockery, a bait Victor recognized from years of boardroom battles. Victor didn't sit. He stood, hands clasped behind his back, his posture rigid but not aggressive. "I'm here about Margaret," he said, his tone even, cutting through Kane's taunt. "The debt she paid. Your debt." The ring pressed against his chest, a steady pulse grounding him as he spoke. Kane's smirk faltered, then widened. "Oh, that," he said, waving a hand dismissively. She was collateral damage, Victor. You crushed my firm, my family's legacy, in that merger fight. I lost everything. So I made sure you paid one way or another. He leaned forward, eyes glinting. She didn't tell you, did she? All those years scraping by to cover my losses while you sipped champagne in your tower. Poetic, don't you think? The word stung, a deliberate jab at Victor's pride, but he didn't flinch. His ribs ached, a dull echo of the crash, but his face remained a mask of control. He could see it now. Kane's revenge, twisting a legal loophole to pin the penalties on Margaret, the woman Victor had left vulnerable. 20 years of her labor, her silence, all to shield him from a fight he'd won without knowing the cost. The ring burned, a silent indictment, but he held his ground. You went after her because you couldn't touch me, Victor said, his voice low, steady. That's not justice, Robert. That's cowardice. He didn't raise his tone, didn't let the anger simmering in his gut break free. He'd come to confront, not to destroy. Not yet. Kane laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. Call it what you want. She paid because you walked away. Your honor's a joke, Grayson, built on her back while you played king. Look at you now, sniffing. Around like a dog with a bone. What's the plan? Throw money at it, buy her forgiveness? He stood, leaning across the desk, his voice rising. You're nothing without your checkbook. Victor's jaw tightened, the ring a cold weight against his heart. Kane's words were a mirror, reflecting the man he'd been. Arrogant, blind, chasing victories at any cost. But he wouldn't bite, wouldn't give Kane the satisfaction of a reaction. He took a slow breath, his hands steady behind him. I'm not here to buy anything, he said, his gaze locking with Kane's. I'm here to understand what I owe her, and I'll settle it, my way, not yours. Kane sneered, but Victor turned, stepping toward the door. He wouldn't waste words on a man who thrived on spite. The truth was his now, a debt he'd carry, not to Kane but to Margaret. As he reached for the handle, Kane called after him. She's tougher than you, Grayson. Always was. You'll never match that. Victor paused, the words sinking in, but he didn't look back. He left, the door closing with a soft click, Kane's laughter fading behind him. Outside, the city hummed, indifferent to the battle within. He pulled out his phone, dialing Margaret's number, a number he'd gotten. From the hospital, another quiet trespass. She answered on the third ring, her voice wary. What do you want, Victor? I saw Kane, he said, keeping his tone soft, measured. I know what he did. What you did. I'm not here to fight you, Margaret. I just need you to know. I'll make it right. Not with money. With what matters. He waited. The silence. Stretching, his breath visible in the cool air. She didn't snap, didn't hang up. I didn't do it for you, she said finally, her voice firm but not cold. I did it for me, so I could stand on my own. Don't take that from me, Victor. Don't you dare. The line clicked dead, leaving him with her words and the hum of the city. He pocketed the phone, his hand brushing the chain beneath his shirt. She'd kept the debt from him not to protect his honor but hers, her strength, her pride. And yet, it tied them together, a thread he couldn't sever. He walked to his car, the streets gleaming under streetlights, and caught his reflection in a shop window. The man staring back wasn't the titan he'd built, sharp suit, cold eyes, but someone older, quieter, shaped by a truth he couldn't outrun. Back in her apartment, Margaret sat on her worn chair, the quilt pulled tight, around her shoulders. Her shift had ended early, and she'd come home to find the echo of Victor's presence. The notebook moved, the air disturbed. She reached into a drawer, pulling out a small wooden box. Inside was her wedding ring, dulled by time but unbroken. She didn't keep it to remember him. She kept it to remind herself she'd survived him. Her fingers closed around it, the metal cool against her palm, and her eyes softened, just for a moment. Victor drove through the city, the ring against his chest a vow he wouldn't break again. Kane's taunts, Margaret's resolve, they were mirrors, showing him the man he'd been and the one he could be. He wouldn't fight with fury or force. He'd face this with dignity, not for his pride, but for hers, for the debt he'd repay in ways she might never see. The Brooklyn Bridge stretched before Victor Grayson, its cables glistening under a Relentless rain. Night had fallen heavy over Manhattan, the city's lights smudged into a watercolor blur by the storm. He stood at the edge of the pedestrian walkway, the exact spot where his Bentley had crashed days ago, where fate had dragged Margaret back into his life. His coat hung open, soaked through, the wind biting at his skin. But he didn't move. The ring against his chest was a cold anchor, a tether to the moment he'd come to face. He'd called her, asked her to meet him here, not to demand, not to plead, but to finish what the crash had started. Headlights swept past, their beams catching the rain in fleeting arcs, but Victor's eyes were fixed on the figure approaching. Through the downpour. Margaret. She walked with purpose, her umbrella abandoned somewhere behind her, her scrubs clinging to her frame. The wind whipped her gray-streaked hair across her face, but she didn't falter. She stopped a few feet away, her breath visible in the chill, her eyes locking with his. Fierce, steady, unyielding. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice cutting through the rain's roar. "This doesn't change anything." She didn't shout, didn't need to. Her words carried the weight of 25 years, a quiet strength that made Victor's chest ache more than the bruised ribs beneath his shirt. He took a step closer, hands open at his sides, rain streaming down his face. "I'm not here to change the past," he said, his voice low, steady despite the storm. "I'm here to own it." He reached beneath his collar, pulling the chain free, the ring glinting faintly in the headlight's glow. "I've worn this every day since I left you, Margaret. Not out of love, not at first, but as a punishment. For the man I was. For what I did to you." Her gaze flickered to the ring, then back to his face, a shadow of something, pain, maybe recognition, crossing her features. But she didn't soften. "You don't get to decide what that means to me," she said, her tone firm, unshaken. "You left. I stayed. I paid. That's the story." Victor nodded, the rain masking the tremor in his breath. He sank to one knee, not in surrender, but in reverence, the pavement cold and rough beneath him. "I know," he said, looking up at her through the deluge. "I saw Cain. I know what he did. What you did. 20 years, Margaret. You carried my debt, my victory, while I built towers and pretended I'd won. I don't deserve your forgiveness. I'm not asking for it, but I need you to hear this. I was wrong, and I'll spend whatever's left of me making it right. Not for my pride, but for yours." The wind howled, tugging at her scrubs, but she stood like a pillar, rain tracing, paths down her face. For a moment she was silent, her eyes searching his, testing, weighing. Then she spoke, her voice softer but no less resolute. "I didn't pay it for you, Victor. I paid it for me, so I could look in the mirror and know I didn't break. So I could stand here, right now, and tell you I didn't need you then, and I don't need you now." She paused, her hands clenching at her sides. "But I did it for something else, too. So the world wouldn't see you as the man Cain wanted them to. A cheat. A coward. I couldn't let that happen." The words hit him harder than the crash, a twist that stole his breath. She'd borne his burden not just for herself, but for him, for the honor he'd thrown away, the man she'd once believed in. He bowed his head, rain dripping from his hair, the ring dangling between them like a bridge across the years. "I didn't know," he whispered, the confession raw, unguarded. "I didn't see." "You didn't look," she said, stepping closer, her shadow falling over him. "But I'm not here to punish you, Victor. I'm here because you asked, and because I'm tired. Tired of carrying it alone." Her voice cracked, just for a moment, and she reached into her pocket, pulling out a small, dulled ring. Hers, the match to his. She held it out, not an offering, but a truth. "I kept this, not for you, for me. To remind myself I survived." Victor rose, slow and deliberate, his eyes on the ring in her hand. The rain blurred them together. Two figures, two rings, two lives torn apart and now colliding. He didn't take it, didn't reach. Instead, he stepped forward, closing the distance, and pulled her into his arms. She stiffened, then softened, her hands resting against his chest, The rings pressed between them. The embrace wasn't passion, it was recognition, a quiet mending of something neither could name. "I'll live better," he said into her hair, his voice steady through the rain. "Not for me, not for us, but for what you carried, for what you deserve." He felt her nod, a small, reluctant motion, and they stood there, the storm raging around them, headlights sweeping past like silent witnesses. From the shadows, a photographer watched, his camera raised. The flash went off, but he lowered it, pocketing the shot. Some moments even the press knew weren't for sale. The rain swallowed the click, leaving Victor and Margaret alone on the bridge. A man and a woman, stripped bare by truth, holding onto dignity in the downpour. Victor pulled back, meeting her eyes. "What now?" he asked, not a demand but an invitation. She wiped rain from her face, her gaze steady. "You live, Victor. Not for me, but for something bigger. That's all I'll ever ask." She turned, walking back into the night, her ring still in her hand, her steps firm against the wet stone. He watched her go, the ring against his chest warm for the first time in years. The bridge stood silent, a testament to what they'd lost, and what they might still reclaim. A year had passed since the rain-soaked night on the Brooklyn Bridge, and Victor Grayson's world had shifted. Not with the crash of empires, but with the quiet turn of a new day. The Upper East Side mansion stood empty now, its marble halls silent, its chandeliers dim. He'd sold it months ago, trading the hollow grandeur for a modest brownstone a few blocks from Margaret's hospital. The move wasn't a headline. It wasn't meant to be. It was a choice, one he'd made with the same steady hand that once signed billion-dollar deals, but this time it was for something smaller, truer. Morning light streamed through the brownstone's kitchen window, catching the steam rising from a pot of coffee on the stove. Victor stood at the counter, his sleeves rolled up, pouring the brew into two mismatched mugs, one chipped, one faded, both borrowed from Margaret's apartment. Across the room she sat at a wooden table, slicing bread with a practiced ease, her gray hair loose around her shoulders. She wore a sweater instead of scrubs today, her first day off in weeks, and the sight of her there in his space stirred a warmth he hadn't known he could still feel. "Too strong?" he asked, setting a mug in front of her, his voice light but careful. He'd learned to make coffee her way. Dark, no sugar, over the months they'd spent circling each other, not as lovers, not as strangers, but as something new. She took a sip, her lips quirking slightly. "Survivable," she said, dry but not unkind. She didn't look at him long, her focus returning to the bread. But the ease in her posture said what words didn't. They weren't rebuilding the past. They were carving a present, piece by piece. Victor sat across from her, the ring still hanging against his chest, no longer a punishment, but a reminder. He'd spent the year unmaking the man he'd been, not with grand gestures, but with quiet acts. The money from the mansion had gone to the hospital, funding a new wing for the overworked staff Margaret had carried for years. He'd stepped back from Grayson Enterprises, handing the reins to a younger board, and taken up work with a local clinic, advising on budgets, not profits. It wasn't redemption. He didn't believe in easy fixes, but it was purpose. A debt repaid in ways she'd never asked for, but deserved. Margaret set the knife down, pushing a plate of bread between them. "You didn't have to do all this, you know," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. "The hospital, the clinic, I didn't need you to play savior." "I'm not," he replied, meeting her eyes. "I'm not saving anyone. I'm living, better, like you said, for something bigger." His voice was steady, the words a vow he'd kept since that night on the bridge. He'd fought the urge to control, to fix her life with his wealth. Instead, he'd listened, learned. Her strength had shown him how. She nodded, a small, reluctant motion, and took a bite of bread. The silence that followed was comfortable, broken only by the hum of the city waking outside. They didn't talk about the rings often, but they were there. His on the chain, hers in the wooden box she'd brought over one evening, not to wear, but to share. They'd placed them side by side on the table once, not as a promise of marriage, but as markers of what they'd endured, what they'd become. They didn't need to wear them to know their weight. The past year hadn't been easy. The press had circled after the bridge, sniffing for a scandal, but the photographer's silence, his choice to keep that moment private, had dulled their hunger. Victor had faced Kane again, not with fists or lawsuits, but with a settlement. That stripped the lawyer's last claims and funded a trust for Margaret's staff. She'd resisted at first, her pride a wall he'd learned not to breach, but she'd accepted it, not for herself, but for the nurses who'd stood by her. Victor sipped his coffee, the bitterness grounding him. He'd spent decades chasing a version of honor tied to power, to wealth, his father's ghost driving him to prove he wouldn't fail. Now, he saw it differently. Honor wasn't the tower he'd built, or the headlines he'd commanded. It was this, the chipped mug, the bread sliced by her hands, the life he was shaping not for himself, but for those he'd once left behind. Margaret glanced at him, her eyes softening just enough to notice. "You're different," she said, almost to herself. "Quieter. I didn't think you could be." He smiled faintly, a rare crack in his reserve. "I had a good teacher." He didn't elaborate. She didn't need him to. She'd shown him strength in silence, dignity in struggle, and he'd spent the year learning to mirror it, not with words, but with choices. She stood, brushing crumbs from her hands, and crossed to the window. The dawn painted her in gold, softening the lines of a life hard won. "I kept going because I had to," she said, her back to him. "You didn't have to change, Victor, but you did." He joined her, standing close but not touching, the rings a quiet bond between them. "I had to," he echoed. "Not for you. Not just for you, but for me. To look in the mirror and see something worth keeping." They stayed there, watching. The city stir, the morning unfolding in small, ordinary moments. A vendor opening his cart, a dog walker braving the chill. Victor's hand brushed hers, a fleeting contact she didn't pull away from. They didn't need more. Not yet. The rings rested on the table behind them, not worn, not discarded, but present, a testament to survival, to dignity reclaimed. Outside, the world moved on, indifferent to their quiet victory. But inside, in the warmth of that dawn-lit room, Victor and Margaret stood together. Not as they'd been, but as they were. Two souls who'd faced the dark and found light. Not in power or pride, but in each other, in the lives they'd touched, in the honor they'd forged from the ashes of what was. If this journey of heart and honor moved you, don't forget to hit that like button. It means the world to us. And if you want more stories that lift the spirit and stir the soul, subscribe now and join our community. Let's keep the light of inspiration burning together. See you in the next chapter.